All right, Bigfoot Society, we got the privilege of talking with Mr. Dustin Severs. He is the author of a book that everyone should be well aware of. I'm going to talk about it for a few minutes right off the bat. The Abominable Snowman of California. And if you're watching YouTube, I want you to see how thick this is. It is almost 500 pages. And wow, Dustin, it is such an incredible read. I want to say first, hats off to you. It took you multiple years to write this, correct?
That's correct. So it's easy for me to remember. So I started writing it around the time of the 50th anniversary for the Patterson Gimlin film, which was October of 2017. And I just launched the book on October 28th. So it's been almost exactly 6 years. But actually I wrote a book in 2/3 because I had originally set out to write a book about the Patterson Gimlin film. And I did that for a couple years. And after a while, it became obvious it was just way too massive of a book. So I said, hey, I could easily break this up into, I wanted to cover the period from 58 to 79. So I'll just split this down the middle, have a pre PG film book and a post PG film book. So I'm about 65, 70% done with the second book, which I'm hoping to launch on October 20th, 2024.
It's almost like multiple books in one. One way I can explain it is, so I talk a lot with people like Tate Hieronymus, Jonathan Easley, Ron Man Reed, Alex Petikoff, people like that have a lot of knowledge about the history, especially Tate. He's got a lot of history about how things align. And I've always thought, I was like, man, it would be great if there was just a place where all this stuff was, because there hadn't been a go-to book where it's just all laid out, the history, and you don't have to keep texting Daniel Perez and hope that he answers some random question you have. Man, you lay it all out about all the crazy stuff that happened leading up to the Patterson Gimlin recording on October 2067. But it's way before that. It's back in the
Mm.
late 50s, and you're talking about Rene Dehinden and John Green and Bob Titmus, and it's wild. And I'm not a super Bigfoot scholar, but just to see it all laid out.
The creative nonfiction that goes back, probably the person who made it famous, Truman Capote, when he wrote his book In Cold Blood in the early 60s. He did it much more than I did. I say, for those who don't understand literary nonfictions, yeah, it does require the author to fill in gaps. They basically use techniques associated with novels like dialogue and scenes, inner monologue. So I say the book is really probably 85% just traditional nonfiction, mix in a little bit of literary nonfiction, scenes and dialogue. And yeah, I do like to tell the scenes through the perspective of one particular person. And yeah, but I went through tremendous pains to be as accurate as possible. So I knew from the
Mm.
get-go, I was like, a lot of people are going to love this literary nonfiction stuff. There's going to be other people who say, I like the book. I just wish you didn't do this fake fictional dialogue. And yeah, it is fictional, but actually almost everything people, for example, there's a scene where Ivan Sanderson and his two colleagues are driving the station wagon
Oh,
and they
it's
have this
great. Yeah.
debate. So
Yeah.
I didn't want to write an analytical book looking at whether or not Bigfoot or the Abominable Snowman was a reality. But I knew that I had to touch on that subject, so I did it through dialogue between two characters. And almost everything that Ivan T. Sanderson says in that chapter are things he actually said in real life. So I've got some of the Ivan T. Sanderson books and interviews. And I just compiled this huge list, and then I just basically make an argument out of it. And that's how I've done almost all the scenes in the book. There's a chapter where Al Hodgson's having a conversation with Don Abbott, and Al Hodgson actually said all those things that he's credited. So I took tremendous pains to be as accurate as possible in the literary nonfiction scenes.
Peter Byrne's in there. You have Jerry Crew.
Mm.
I had no idea how he lost his wife tragically, and his background in Christianity,
Mhm.
was that from actual interviews that you read?
Yeah, that's all absolutely true. Yeah, he was
Wow.
a bit of a religious fundamentalist. He was a believer in Bigfoot, but he was adamant that he didn't believe in evolution as a
Mm,
creationist, so he was adamant that Bigfoot existed. I think there's some inner monologue where he said if these things exist, Noah must have had them on the ark. That
right.
sounds a little cheesy, but he actually said that. That's why I used it.
Did he
So
really? He actually
yeah,
said that in an
yeah.
interview?
Mhm.
There's also the scene where the back and forth with Jimmy Stewart, and I was like, "Man, you're hitting all the great stuff."
Jeremiah, what makes any story great and interesting, be it a movie, a book, a play, is great characters. The story of the Bigfoot legend has just an amazing cast of characters, just some wacky, colorful guys. And as a writer, it was so fun to research and write about these guys. And you can ask for better characters to write about than guys like Rene Dehinden, Ivan T. Sanderson, Ray Wallace. And then I've always found Green and Dehinden's relationship so hysterical because they're the
It's
classic
wild.
straight guy, wise guy duo, comedy duo, like from the past. Yeah, and yeah, those are
Cranky
probably
and
my favorite.
lanky.
My favorite, Lanky and Crank. And I have to
Yeah.
credit Todd Prescott. He's the one who came up with that, and I loved it. So I told him right away. I was like, I'm going to use that in the book. Is that okay? He's like, yeah, sure. But yeah, I use that throughout the book, and yeah, they're probably my two favorite. I say that that's why I focus on the boat most is Green and Dehinden. And same in the second book is mostly about Dehinden and Green because it gets really interesting. Green and Dehinden's relationship in the 1970s. But yeah, it's
Oh, yeah,
amazing
sure.
cast of characters. And Green and Dehinden are my favorite. We talk about the most famous duo in Bigfoot history. Of course, people think of Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin.
Roger
Those
and
who
Bob,
really
yeah.
know the history, they know the OGs are Rene Dehinden and John Green, undoubtedly.
Was there a character that you found hardest to write from the perspective of?
Yeah, I think when you have a really interesting character, do you want to really explain to the reader what they're all about? It's best to write from the perspective of somebody else. For example, I have when I write about the scene with Ivan T. Sanderson's told from the perspective of Robert Christie, who was an actual person who who traveled with him in that 1959 trip for Random House when he was preparing for his book, is when he introduced Sanderson to Bigfoot. And I can't stress enough how important of a figure Ivan T. Sanderson is in Bigfoot history. So yeah, they were all fun. I wanted to write from everybody's perspective. I tried to get everybody, and yeah, I think I pretty much hit every. There's probably some people I didn't write from their perspective, but yeah, it's always fun to mix it up.
Hats off for figuring out how to pay homage to Rene Dehinden's way of talking in a
Yeah.
fantastic way.
Mm.
It just because I'm sure people going into this, like, have watched the videos on Todd Prescott's channel, Sasquatch Archives. It does not pull any punches, but there's a scene that threw me for a loop. It's so intense, and I would love to know your thoughts behind this scene.
Mhm.
It's the shotgun scene, and the great thing about this book is you go in the back and there's just a list for every chapter. Like, I got this part from this interview or from this and this, and I'm just curious the ideas for the shotgun scene. Where did that come from, and also what liberties did you take, if any, in that scene itself?
Sure, yeah, that is a great scene. So it's absolutely true. First off, so I got that
Wow.
story from two separate people. I got from Keith Kiazari, who was the South African. He was a pilot, so he was physically there when it happened. And then the story was corroborated by Thomas Steenberg. I spoke to Keith Kiazari over the phone. Great guy, but doing well, and he reluctantly told me about it. Like he mentioned, oh, and then I was like, well, what happened? And he was hesitant to tell me. He told me the story. So after that, I messaged Thomas Steenberg. I was like, Thomas, have you ever heard of this story? And Thomas chuckled. And he's like, yeah, John Green told me the story before he died. And John Green said he would never repeat the story until after Rene died. So it was, yeah, the story was told by two people who were physically there when it happened. As far as liberties, All I know is this: Keith Chiazzari and neither Keith Chiazzari or John Green knew these specifics. All I know is it was an extremely hot day, and somehow Rene got stuck for hours, if not the entire day, stranded. And when they returned, he was apoplectic, and Green went up to him and he pointed a shotgun at him and threatened to kill him.
It is so intense, and the whole book would make a great movie, or maybe even a few movies, really. But that scene, oh man,
Yeah, I know I'm the first person to write about it. I believe Thomas has spoken about it on
yeah,
podcasts in the past. They had several rifts throughout their life, so I think their falling out was at the Pacific Northwest expedition, and then they always came back, and then that was obviously a big one. They actually got back together after that, so what wasn't really the straw that broke the camel's back was in the early 70s is when John Green was able to sell his newspaper, the Agassiz Advance, and was able to make a
yep.
living full time off of writing. And it's safe to say that Rene was just really jealous. He had no fallback. He lived only for the Sasquatch. So when he saw Green having success, obviously, I think he had a lot of envy. And then the way John Green tells the story is that when John started sharing some of his research, specifically pictures that Rene had captured himself. That was the final straw. But contrary to popular belief, they didn't have a complete falling. The band broke up after that. They no longer collaborated together. But for years, until the day Dehinden died, they continued to correspond through letters, through phone calls. They were together occasionally. I think Thomas Stompers said he's recalled several times where he had like dinner with them in the 1990s. They just didn't work with each other anymore, and it unfortunately did get really nasty. I have scores, if not hundreds, of letters from the 1950s to the late 1990s between Dehinden, Green, and Grover Krantz and other people, and it got pretty nasty. It's sad because John Green was such a nice guy, and
He totally,
yeah.
man.
Yeah, they're all flawed characters in the book, and I think one exception is probably John Green, who's really a thoughtful, intelligent, honest person. And honestly, Rene, for all his faults, and he was no doubt a ruthless SOB, but he was nothing if not honest. He was always an honest person. He never claimed to see. From his whole life, somebody asked, "Have you ever seen a Sasquatch?" No. Have you ever had any experiences? No. So he was a very honest guy.
He's honest. He's also a big jerk, but he's honest.
Yes.
Like he's one of those guys. I was like, maybe there'll be some redeeming.
I think there are some redeeming. I think he has a lot of redeeming qualities. I think everybody knows somebody in their life who the person's a total asshole, but he's a good guy deep down inside, and you like him for all his faults. So yeah, he's just a very extremely flawed person.
Yeah, your book is great in showing that there were some really strong personalities, and a lot of people just really did not like each other. And it's incredible that the whole thing just didn't fall apart early on, more than I guess it did in some ways. Have you ever been to that area out there yourself, Dustin?
Oh yeah, so I live in Southern Oregon. So I'm about 10 miles north of the California border, and my house where I'm sitting right now actually sits on the foothills of the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains, which is the same mountain range in which Bluff Creek is located. So it's about 70 miles as the crow flies from where I live. But it takes about 3.5 hours to go out there. But yeah, I've been going out there for 7 years now, at least a few times a year. Yes, I know the area. I feel like it's very important. If you want to write about something, you really need to know the lay of the land yourself. So yeah, I go up there. I work the Bluff Creek Project guys.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
so that's how I know Tate and all those other guys. Jonathan, they come out there every summer. Always have our summer camp. We typically go out there every October, but there was a fire this year, and then I'm not sure what happened. The last 2 Octobers I've not been out there, and I always love going out there around October 20th.
So you've been involved with different Bigfoot research parties, it sounds like. Have you ever had any interesting things happen when you've been out there? Have you ever heard anything, seen anything, things of that nature?
I have not. Yeah, I'm a skeptic, but I'm not an evangelical skeptic. I'm not Greg Long. When I wrote the book, it wasn't my intent to to dissuade anybody either way. I really want the book to be liked by skeptics and believers alike. So that was my intent. Despite being a skeptic, I still hold this a tremendous romance and love for Bigfoot. So every time I go up to Bluff Creek, when I turn off Highway 96 and start going up the Go Road or Bluff Creek Road, I always have butterflies in my stomach. I'm always looking around. I usually got my Bigfoot playlist going in my vehicle. So yeah, I love the legend.
There was a part that of Bigfoot history I'd never. I guess I've knew a little bit about it, but the Blue Creek Mountain,
Mhm.
that was just fascinating. Is that an area that you've actually have you ever been to that area?
No, yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. So
yeah.
it's actually, the Blue Creek is just the adjacent watershed to Bluff Creek. It's basically the same locations. Where they found the tracks in the summer of '67 is just a few miles from where the PG film site is, and also where Jerry Crew made his first plaster cast. That's the amazing thing about Bluff Creek is the holy of holies when it comes to
Right.
Bigfoot. That's where it all started. And the amazing thing is all the most historic places like Louse Camp, the PG film site, Blue Creek Mountains, all within a few mile radius of each other. So if you ever drive up there, you're pretty much once you get up there, you're close to all the great historic spots. It's not an easy place to get to though. It's pretty rugged. So yeah.
Because in that Blue Creek Mountain area, like they said there were like hundreds and hundreds of tracks that were
Mhm.
seen, correct?
Yeah, I believe
Uh,
there's thousands of them.
yeah.
So yeah, and so so I say the book is there's three seminal events that I cover in the book. And in part one, I cover that classic fall of 1958 in Humboldt County. Part three, I cover the Slick expeditions, which go from the fall of '59 to the fall of 1962. Then section four, I cover the big year, as Rene Dehinden referred to as, which is 1967. So you say 1967, you automatically think of the Patterson Gimlin film. Of course, that's where everything culminated to that moment. But there's some amazing events that occurred that year before that, and the big one being the Blue Creek Mountain tracks, which were actually the tracks that Roger Patterson heard about, which got him to get Bob Gimlin and him to go to Bluff Creek later that fall.
Has there ever been like a focus on the Blue Creek Mountain area? Because I know it's
Yeah.
right next to the film site, but it
Mhm.
feels like it's being overlooked. And if there was an area where there was thousands of Bigfoot foot tracks
Mhm.
at one point, you think we would be looking just a little bit into that area, but I don't know. It's
Yeah, no, it's one of the seminal events, and I don't think writers ever really wrote about it. John Green wrote about it in his books, but he doesn't go in tremendous detail. John Green, great guy, but his writing's about as dry as his speech was. He has great information in his books, but they're certainly not page turners. But yeah, a lot of valuable information in his books. But yeah, it was a seminal moment in Bigfoot history, and that's what prompted Roger Patterson to come to Bluff Creek with Bob Gimlin later that fall, and of course that's where the book covers the what I like to refer to as the classic period of Bigfoot history. So that's the fall of 1958 to the fall of '67. The significance of the fall of 1958 because that's when Bigfoot it was the origin, the genesis of Bigfoot from as understood in American popular culture. I have to underscore that because it offend people who are true blue believers. Obviously, if Bigfoot is indeed a flesh and blood animal, it's been around for thousands, not millions of years. But my book focuses on the history of Bigfoot in American popular culture. So from that standpoint, Bigfoot absolutely started on October 5th, 1958, when Andrew Gonzalez was the regional editor for the Humboldt Times, wrote an article about Jerry Crew and had a picture of his plaster cast footprint. And he coined, this is a little controversial, but he was the first to coin the name Bigfoot. There was precursors, but as I write in the book, for all intents and purposes, that marked the genesis of Bigfoot. Of course, the significance of 1967 being the Patterson Gimlin film, which changed everything. The Patterson film is the central story when it comes to the Bigfoot legends. It was really a paradigm shift. I say in three ways. with the Patterson-Gimlin film, the symbolism of the Bigfoot legend transitioned from being these giant inexplicable tracks in the earth to this shocking footage captured on Kodachrome color. And the crown jewel of evidence went from these plaster cast footprints to the film itself. And the face of the legend went from Jerry Crew's picture to Patty doing his famous frame 352 strut. Another way it changed is how is the general public's conception of what Bigfoot was. During the classic period from 57 to 68, Bigfoot was largely considered to be a wild man as opposed to a giant ape, as John Green had long argued. Specifically in British Columbia, the Sasquatch, they were considered to be a band of an Indian tribe, essentially large, giant human beings with long hair on their head. And it's a little different in Bluff Creek in Northern California, but they essentially believed Bigfoot was a wild man as well. But that all changed with the Patterson film. Patty is just what John Green had argued before that is essentially this giant gorilla on human legs. So this to this day, when people think of Bigfoot, they think of this giant gorilla and not a wild man. And I say the third big change with the Patterson-Gimlin film is just the popularity of the legend. So when Ivan Sanderson published his article in Argosy magazine in 1958 was the first which they published the photos from the Patterson-Gimlin film. I say the Bigfoot legend was still somewhat local. I say the vast majority of Americans had never heard of Bigfoot. Now you fast forward to January 1981 when Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office. It's a household name. The entire country knows what Bigfoot was because the 1970s was the decade for Bigfoot. At 58 to 67 was the classic period. 67 to 79 was the golden age. And that's when that's when you start having all these great cheesy, yet awesome documentaries, the Hollywood movies, the books. And that's why I dedicated the book to Gen X, because that was the generation that grew up in the 70s and 80s. And that's why this Bigfoot is particularly special to that Gen X generation. I was born in 79, so I was at the end of the Gen X. I wasn't a kid in the 70s, I was a kid in the 80s, but I still saw all those great documentaries and movies. So I can totally relate. And I always say that Bob Gimlin, so for almost 30 years, Bob Gimlin was a recluse. He wouldn't talk about the Bigfoot legend or the film because he was ridiculed by his peers. Then in 2003, he reluctantly agreed to attend the International Bigfoot Symposium in Willow Creek, which was ran by Al Hodgson and John Green, two people he really trusted. So he came in there, he came to the event, he spoke, and he was shocked at the ovation he received. He was like a rock star. And he may have wondered what changed. I can tell you exactly what changed. All those kids that from the 1970s that grew up watching all this stuff on all these films about Bigfoot were now the adults running the world. But yeah, so that's the second book I'm working on that it really focuses on the PG film and its aftermath and how it just absolutely blew up in the 1970s. So again, I can't stress the significance of that decade. To me, it's the best decade when it comes to Bigfoot. And it's all credited to the Patterson-Gimlin film. That was the catalyst. That was the catalyst that got everything going.
Do you have a favorite documentary that you remember watching? Yeah,
like old ones?
Yeah, one of the older ones.
Yeah, I get the names mixed up. Some are better than others. As far as recent ones, I really like the Sasquatch Odyssey, which is similar in my book as one of the inspirations for the book. But yeah, I love all those. Leonard Nimoy in Search of, and Arthur C. Clarke had some. I love all the documentaries in too. There's one in particular, one documentary that I particularly I keep getting the names mixed up. And people just don't understand that back in the 1970s, this is obviously before the internet, but this is also before cable television. You would have these documentaries on network television. This is a time where if you had a slot on primetime network television, they would get 30, 40, 50 million people watching it. It's very different from today. And the Patterson-Gimlin film was showed repeatedly in documentaries throughout the 1970s, which is the reason it eventually garnered that reputation as being the second most watched amateur film in history, second only to the Zapruder film. I don't think the Zapruder film was released till like 75 or 76, but yeah, all about the 1970s is a fascinating topic. But yeah, my book focuses on that period before the Patterson Gimlin film, 57 to 58 to 67, which was all about giant tracks as opposed to the film.
What are your thoughts on Ray Wallace? How do you view him as an individual? Because he is a large part of this book at the
Mhm.
beginning and at the end of it.
Yeah, sure. So I actually really, as the more research I did on the guy, I really came to really like the guy. He was a batshit crazy. But
It is wild.
he was a functional nut. He was actually quite successful in his career. He ran several businesses. He had a family. He was a loving father, somewhat of a pillar in the community, although everybody knew he was a little loony between his Bigfoot exploits to his astronomical work with flying saucers. That was interesting. So yeah, no, I don't believe that he's responsible for all the tracks were up there. I would say my guess was it was perhaps he was the main culprit, but I would my guess is several people were faking tracks up there, but maybe not. So I try to give it a fair shake. It wasn't until the last chapter of the book that I really look into the legitimacy of the crude tracks and the double ball tracks. You have to distinguish between those two. So I'll do that real quick. So the ball tracks had that's a term that John Green used to describe them. Some people call it a split ball. Basically, had this hourglass shape to it, and it's a very unique track. And those were by far the most prevalent tracks found up in, in Bluff Creek throughout this classic period. But the interesting thing is that the crew track, the original tracks that he held up, the cast he held up on the October 5th, 1958, is actually a different kind of track. So when Ray Wallace died in 2002, his family went to the newspapers and this went viral, and they said our father was Bigfoot, and they had proof. So they showed this whole trove of stompers, I call them in the book. Basically, they're like these wooden shoes you can strap on the boots like snow, and it goes tromping about. And they are actually so some of the stompers have were absolutely identical to the double ball tracks, and there's also a set of tracks which are a dead ringer for the original track that Jerry Crew made a plaster cast of. However, John Green makes a counter argument to this. So the Blue Creek, I keep saying the Blue Creek Mountain. The double ball tracks were first found by Bob Titmus in November 1958. And around that time, he and Jerry Crew, who were childhood friends, made replica copies of the plaster cast and they were selling them. So they were all over the place in the 1950s and 1960s. So John Green argues that, yeah, his stompers are dead ringers. He simply took those replicas and
Mhm.
used it as a template to make his stompers. So it's the chicken or the egg argument. So I try to give I try to give both sides an even shake in that last chapter, and it's a legitimate argument that John Green makes.
One of the coolest parts of the book, I love it, are the drawn maps at the beginning. What's the story behind those maps? Because they are
I
fantastic.
know. I'll tell you the story about a guy named William Sullivan. If you probably and I have an entire shelf full of his books. He does Oregon hiking books, and he's been doing it for probably 20, 30 years, and they're extremely popular. He constantly comes out with new editions, and I've always been absolutely in love with his maps. I think they're so cool. But when I knew I wanted to make maps, I emailed this guy and I said, "Hey, I'm a huge fan. I have like an entire shelf full of your hiking books. I'm a trail runner, so I use his books all the time." I go, "The thing I love the most is your maps are so great." And he's a local historian. He writes history books, and this is somewhat local history, as Bluff Creek is 70 miles from here. And I asked him, "Hey, would you be willing to make the maps for my books?" And he said he'd never done it before, but he'd be happy to do it. So yeah, I was absolutely thrilled to have his maps. I'm glad you say that because I love the books, the maps too. I think they're just fun. That's what I like about them most. They really I think it would get the reader excited to really dive into the book.
I've heard these places over the last few years from people like Tate and Jonathan and Alex and Ron and all those guys. And it's cool because these maps, they lay it all out. Like, oh,
Mm,
it's all this stuff is right here, and there's a one that's more detailed of the area around the film site and Laos camp. There's also one that's a little bit wider out
mhm.
of the Northern California area, and it's you're not gonna you can't just find maps like that anywhere else. Like you have to have them in a very specific resource. This book that you've written. So taking a few years in a project like this, were there any parts of it where you're writing it, but you're finding out new stuff? The story is changing as I'm writing it because
Mhm.
I'm starting to find this new evidence. And were there any parts that the story just seemed to have a life of its own while you were trying to put it on
Yeah,
paper?
absolutely. So they always say that you don't have to be an expert on the subject matter when you start a book, only when you finish it. So that was certainly the case for me. A lot of stuff I was learning as I went. Sometimes I would learn more stuff and I have to go back. Yeah, I spent 6 years just obsessively going through newspaper archives. And that's one advantage that writers today have over those from just 10 years ago is we have this amazing resource where all these newspapers are digitized now the Humboldt Times and the Humboldt Standard have not been digitized, so I actually had to go old school. I had to drive to Humboldt State University and go through the microfilm, and that took a lot of work. So I was able to get all that stuff. I uncovered a lot of stuff has never been uncovered before. I think I was the first person to really write about the British Columbia expedition. So I was able to find a trove of letters between Bob Titmus and Tom Slick, and yeah, it was really fun. Probably doing the research is the fun part. When you have to sit down and write, that's when it gets really hard. But yeah, it was a blast in the research, and yeah, it was. I had no clue that when I started the book, I was going to take me like 2 years. I had no clue the rabbit hole I was going to venture down, and it was my goal. It was a lofty goal. I mean, I wanted to write the most comprehensive book ever written about Bigfoot history because when I got into the subject when I moved here in the spring of 2016, I was shocked there wasn't much out there. There's been a couple people who have written books about the major personalities in this classic period, but it's just very on the surface. They don't do a deep dive. So I thought, wow, it'd be amazing. You have a historical writer with somebody like David Grant or Eric Larson or John Krakauer, which really would take on this subject and spend a couple years researching and writing it. I was like, maybe I'll give it a try. I always love books. I love history. I particularly love origin stories. I love anytime there's something that I'm interested in, I'm always asking myself, how did this start? Particularly when we have these
Mm.
subjects where everybody's generally familiar with, but they don't really know the the true story, the facts from the fictions. So that was the goal I set out in writing this one, and it ended up being a very ambitious undertaking, but somehow I finished it.
How did you find the Titmus letters? Where were those at?
They're in University of Texas at San Antonio. Tom Slick donated his collection there, and it's a
Oh.
massive collection. Fortunately, a lot of the main characters have collections. Ivan T. Sanderson has a massive collection, which is held in Philadelphia. Again, Slick's is in San Antonio. John Green's is right outside of Harrison Hot Springs, and then Bob Titmus and Al Hodgson have their collection at the Willow Creek Museum. Probably forget some other people as well. So yeah, there's some great resources out there.
So that's a China Flats Museum?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. What's in the Bob Titmus collection?
They have a display where they show the cast and stuff, but all the letters and stuff are actually upstairs. It's not open to the public. So I'd asked the curator if I could go through it, and she happily agreed to let me do so. And I was kind of shocked at how much cool stuff there was in there. Like the letter that I'd always heard that in the fall of '58 that Bob Titmus sent a letter to Green telling him to come up about because that's when he first discovered the double ball tracks. I didn't know that letter actually existed. It was actually in the file. I found some stuff and some that's pretty surprising. I can't talk about it yet. So, but yeah, I was like, wow. Thought there for a while. I thought I was close to finding out where Patterson processed the film. I got really excited. Ivan Sanderson's the best. Great letters. He's such an interesting guy. And John Green, on his entire life, he made copies of every single letter he ever wrote, which is so fortunate. We have all that stuff to review.
Talking about Bob Titmus, do you think he was faking evidence, or what do you your thoughts on that?
I don't think there's any evidence that he faked tracks. Based on my impression I got of Bob Titmus from his letter, he seems like a very thoughtful, intelligent guy. He seemed like a serious guy. But I
Mhm.
know that Ivan Sanderson really didn't trust him. Andrew Genzilli didn't trust him, and of course Peter Byrne and Rene Dehinden despised him. I, in my opinion, he's the most overlooked figure in Bigfoot history, mostly because he never talked. He didn't make any movies. He didn't write any books.
Yeah.
He rarely did an interview. He did an interview with the International Cryptozoology Society. I may have said that wrong, in the mid '90s, which is gold. And I believe Daniel Perez did an interview in the '90s as well. But there's almost nothing out there when it comes to Bob Titmus. And in my opinion, the Mount Rushmore of Bigfoot researchers is Green, Dehinden, Peter Byrne, and Bob Titmus. So in the Sasquatch Odyssey documentary, which is a wonderful documentary, they had the four horsemen. They have Green, Dehinden, Byrne, and they have Grover Krantz. And Grover Krantz is, yeah, he's certainly a significant figure. But yeah, I think the I think Titmus was left out just simply due to the fact there's hardly any film or interviews or anything of the guy. But yeah, I think he's overlooked. And I think Jim McLaren is another guy who's really overlooked when it comes to Bigfoot history. And Jim McLaren's still alive and well.
He
He's a great
is
guy,
down in
super
South
intelligent guy.
America.
Hmm. Yeah, fascinating guy, very intelligent person.
I love how you have that the scene in the book where it's like there's a lot of stuff in the book where if you're like a Bigfoot nerd, you're me, "Oh my goodness, that's" it has
Mhm.
Jim, like the Oma statue hasn't been carved yet, and it's
Yeah,
just it's very almost Back to the Future in a way
yeah.
when you're reading the book because you know where it's going, but, it's very cool for sure. Is there a part in here where you're a little bit you're not sure how it might be taken by the community or any that you think might be
Mhm.
more controversial than others the way you interpreted it?
Yeah, I try to keep some of a neutral tone. I think I was successful most of the time, but I think it probably came out that I was uh, perhaps in the end of the introduction, and probably literally the last page and a half is the only time I really get really explicit on my own personal views. But like I said, is I really want to go out of my way to write the book in a manner that both the general audience as well as Bigfooters, be it skeptics or believers, can really like the book. And I've been really pleased that it's been really accepted by the Bigfoot community. That's why yeah, I was absolutely concerned about that. I was also concerned about how, of course, there's hardly anybody left still alive of the character. The only people still alive today that I write about in the book is Jim Claren, and Jim Crew
Mhm.
is still alive. That was Jerry Crew's nephew. And while I was writing the book, Jay Rowland died, Al Hodgson died.
Oh, wow.
Peter Byrne just died
Yep.
in July. Wanja Holmes, who was Renee's wife, died recently, and I think I'm forgetting a couple other people. Yeah, so the last Mohicans is really Jim McLaren. Yeah, I was a little concerned. I did my best in terms of Peter Byrne. I'm not sure if he would like how he was portrayed in the book. I thought I was charitable.
Yeah.
When I started my research, I knew that John Green hated his guts. I always assumed he was just jealous of Peter Byrne, but the more research I did, I really understand where the contempt was coming from. And that went on for decades. And I think the problem was Green and Dehinden, particularly in the '70s, and they would get interviewed for documentaries. And then when it came out, the whole documentary would be about Peter Byrne. He's this handsome guy with the Indiana Jones a fedora, and
Mhm.
he's got the British accent, and he's a big game hunter. He just always stole their thunder, and it drove John Green absolutely bonkers his entire life.
That and, I think you called out that in some of Peter Byrne's books, he didn't even refer to them by name, right?
No, they both did. Yeah, he never. John Green would never printed the name Peter Byrne in any of his books, and in return, he did. Byrne did the same. I think he refers to them derisively as the Canadian journalist, and I'm not sure what he gave me. Yeah, he calls in his last autobiography he wrote a few years ago. He actually does mention Bob Titmus, but he calls him Bob Titmouse, which is actually a name that
It's a Rene
Rene
name,
Dehinden,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
Dehinden coined that one back way back during the Pacific Northwest expedition.
I didn't know how that Rene and Bob Titmus just really did not like each
Mhm.
other. Did you were there certain resources that those interactions you found those in, or was that pretty evident in
One
other
thing I took
places?
liberties in, I blatantly took liberties on was so I have the chapter called Wy'East Motel is one of my favorite ones. I had
Yeah.
my niece read the book. She said that was her favorite chapter. And it's actually
Mhm.
very accurate. Talking about a piece of historical gold. Andrew Gazzoli is another guy who he has his collection at Humboldt State University, and buried within his and let's jump on this for a second. I talk about throughout the book that Jerry Crew had a drawing that he traced the tracks.
Mhm.
That's actually in the collection. There's also all these old letters that people wrote Gonzalez from all over the country in 1958 that's in there. But anyway, I found
Oh, wow.
there's a 10-page memo written by Betty Allen, who is another overlooked figure in Bigfoot history. So she was actually there. I believe it was November 15th, 1959 is when all the Bigfoot Vanguard came. They had a meeting at Wy'East Motel, headed by Tom Slick, laid out the plans for the Pacific Northwest expedition. And Betty wrote notes the entire time she was there,
Mhm.
10 pages worth, basically saying this is who's there, this is what was said, these were the comments. So a lot of that stuff, it was actually, I didn't make up. One thing I did make up is the exchange or the argument between. I just want to underscore how much they
Okay.
despise each other, which was absolutely true.
That's interesting to know. Okay, yeah, that was a very good scene for sure.
And that's true. Jerry Crew
Mm.
busting in at the end, that's all true.
Man, that's awesome.
Yeah, the old
That
lady in
cool.
the corner, that's absolutely true. And why Motel is still there? It's called Bigfoot Motel today, but it looks very similar to what it looked like in the late 1950s. And that cage, the Jim White's caged Bigfoot, the cage is still in the back parking lot. The mannequin's
Really?
gone, but the cage is still there.
Oh, man,
Yeah.
that's
I always
awesome.
wanted because I found out about the cage. Like, God, I wish I could see it. And then one day I was at the Willow Creek Library going through the Calamity Courier mag newspaper. I went through like years, and I just turned over a page and there was a picture of it. I was like, yes, I finally saw it.
That's something I was gonna ask you. Is that newspaper digitized at all?
And Calamity Courier, to my knowledge, is not. So I had to go to the library, and I just took pictures on my old iPhone of it. So yeah, the Agassiz Advance newspaper is not digitized either. So I had to pay a lot of. Unfortunately, my research was during the pandemic, so I would have to like pay private researchers to go get copies of stuff for me. So I got all the Humboldt Standard, Humboldt Times newspapers. Got all this Agassiz Advance newspapers and Calamity Couriers. Yeah, newspapers are probably besides letters are my is the best, but newspapers are great as well.
Man,
Nothing atop letters.
there almost needs to be a Dustin Severs collection someday, I think, with all the resources that you've gotten together for this book. I mean, the Calamity, that was just really I didn't know a lot about that, but through your book, and you talked about how Ray Wallace just started writing these out of control letters to the newspaper and he had some wild out of control claims. Do you think there was any truth to any of that, or this is
Zero,
some
none.
wild stuff he was saying? Yeah.
Yeah, he even said he was involved with the Patterson. Yeah, it's all absolutely ridiculous, and I'm not sure how serious he was when he said it. So I don't know. He's just such an interesting fellow, that Ray Wallace.
Yeah, absolutely. Will we have to wait until the second book to know if you think the Patterson Gimlin film is true or not?
Yes, and I'm gonna do my best to
Okay.
keep somewhat of a neutral tone on that one as well. And yeah, speaking of the Calamity Courier, it just reminded me the editor was a guy named Benny Carroll, was another overlooked figure. I never heard of the guy, just discovered him through my own research. And when Betty Allen left Humboldt County and went back to Alaska, I believe in 1965, he took over the Bigfoot beat in her stead. And I had this theory that me and Daniel Perez have had this competition going on, trying to figure out who wrote the October 25th first article, 1967, of the Patterson film. It was called Mrs. Bigfoot was filmed, so there was not a byline given. So I've been upset. He thinks this guy named Al Tostado. It may be. I tend to disagree. So I've been obsessed trying to find out who it is. And Benny Carroll is one of my top suspects. And I actually I got a list of every person who worked for the newspaper in 1967. I found 3 of them that are still alive, and I was able to actually get them on the phone and talk to them. And every time it's like, yeah, we know what you're talking about, but I don't know who wrote it.
Oh man.
I mean, it seems like a frivolous detail, but it's really not, because he, according to the story, he calls cold on the night of October 20th, like around 9:00 from the ranger station in Willow Creek, and relays his story, and it's pretty extensive story. And yeah, one of the ladies I spoke to, she was very young, obviously at the time, so she's still alive, and she said that it must have been a sports writer, because only a sports writer in the fall on a Friday, they would be reporting on the football game, so they would have answered the phone. Like, that's interesting. So
that's a really interesting detail.
Yeah, because there's always theories that he was. I don't know if it's true that Patterson was inclusion of somebody to write this. I don't know if that's true. Just for some reason I've always been obsessed with trying to find out who the heck wrote that darn article. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why somebody who was on the editorial staff wouldn't get credit for what an article was on the front page. I asked her that, and she said maybe they were embarrassed by it. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just interesting that to this day we don't know who wrote that very important, the first story ever about the film. It was written like hours. It was written literally hours after the event allegedly occurred.
Wow. While you were writing the book, were there any things that you were trying to research that you just had you couldn't find because it was like you tried to research it, you couldn't find the resources, or the trail was cold?
Yeah, I say a lot. There was some. I can't think of any offhand. The one for the second book has to do with trying to find out the ghostwriter for Mrs. Bigfoot was filmed. But yeah, I had a lot of roadblocks that I eventually broke through. So I feel like everything really came together in the end. It's disappointing almost everybody I write about is no longer alive. It's been so great to actually interview John Green or Rene Dehinden. That's why I think it's really important to get Jim McLaren's story on the record. But of course, he's probably around my dad's age. I think he's about 77, 78, but he's in great health. You probably know he lives in South America. He's still trying to find creatures that people say don't exist. They're just much smaller now. He's looking for beetles as opposed to Bigfoot. So that's interesting.
So you were able to interview Jim for this?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I actually sent him a copy of the book as well. So hoping he likes it. Hope he doesn't mind me calling him a hippie, because he absolutely was a hippie.
Yeah.
But he's going to be a much more prominent. He will write much more prominently about him in the second book. I have a big biography written up about him, as well as Al Hodgson. But it's basically the same group of people. I think that's what I think is so cool about the Bigfoot story throughout this period, is the same small fraternity of guys involved from 58 throughout the history of the Bigfoot story. Even the Patterson film, Rene Dehinden owns the rights to the Patterson film.
Right.
When he died, it was handed over to his 2 sons. So yeah, and that was throughout the 70s. That was all about the Patterson film, and Dehinden really turned his focus away from being the bush to just acquiring the rights of he got the right to Patterson's book, the film. He was just obsessed with acquiring the legacy of Patterson's legacy. I'm guessing that he got to a point you know what? I'm never going to find one of these creatures. The chances of it happening is so slim. I'm not even sure if they're still alive. Maybe they went extinct. I think he got to the point where this is it. This. It's not going to get any better than the Patterson film. So if I want to be the guy ultimately who found Bigfoot, I think that's the best route to go, is to acquire the rights to this film, and then he spent most of his later years basically debunking other researchers.
So I'm sure you looked a lot into Rene Dehinden because it feels like you were anyone that you wrote about, you were really researching him. Did you find that he did a lot of traveling around the US to different Bigfoot spots to investigate things? Did you ever come up with any info about that, or did he stick to out in certain areas?
No, he did go all over the country. I know he spent a lot of
Okay.
time in Montana. Of course, his stomping grounds was the greater Harrison Hot Springs, those mountains,
Mhm.
Garibaldi Park, that area. And he went up to the Great Bear, which is a fascinating place. He spent a lot of time in there in the 60s. And yeah, I think the 70s. I know he spent a lot of time in Montana. And like I said, he got to a point where he started turning his focus to the Patterson film. And he spent a lot more time in the courtroom than he did out in the bush.
Right. He's a very interesting character. Your book has lit the fire under me. I'm in central Iowa, so I focus on the Iowa Bigfoot history stuff. And
Mm,
allegedly, he did come out to central Iowa to talk to some guys during the 70s about Bigfoot,
mm.
something that happened regarding Bigfoot out here. But I'm just trying to track down what that exactly was. And as the key players are either gone or extremely old at this time. So we'll see if I ever get the answers for that. Was there a something that, let's say, you had come into the topic before you started writing it, and then
Mm.
out of when you finished the book, your thinking was totally different about
Yeah,
a certain part of the
I see.
history? Yeah.
Yeah, I go back to Peter Burns. Yeah, but all these guys wrote books, or most of them did, and they really had these competing narratives. And I went into it assuming that the animosity that Dehinden and Titmus and Green had towards Byrne was just out of jealousy. But the more research I did, I don't think Peter Byrne was a bad guy. I don't think he was a liar. I would use the phrase I applied to Ivan Sanderson, who was very economical with the truth. He embellished, but his books really are just chock full of errors and just gross inconsistencies. Particularly, he wrote that after Bob Titmus left the Pacific Northwest expedition, they never heard from him again. He knows that's not true. Bob Titmus, in fact, continued a relationship with Tom Slick, in which he ran the British Columbia expedition for 2 years. He was as close to Tom Slick as Peter Byrne was. So perhaps he was getting up there in years, and when he wrote those last books, perhaps that's the reason. I know as a researcher, I was just very frustrated reading his book because there's so many contradictions. Like he would tell, for example, when he tells a story about when that they were at the Yak and Yeti bar in Kathmandu, and they get a letter from Tom Slick telling him about Bigfoot. He has another telling of that story where he's in a cave and a Sherpa runner. And yeah, just I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of his stories you can take with a grain of salt, but he was in fact he that guy went back to the 1940s. He started even before Dehinden and Green was. He was hunting the Yeti before the Shipton tracks came out. So that guy is
Mm,
as old school as you get. So he's definitely he's on the Mount Rushmore without a doubt.
absolutely. As we start to, you know, wind down, but I do have a
Mm.
final question for you. So you spent time out in that area, this area with Bluff Creek and Louse Camp and things of that. Do you think that there is still a Bigfoot presence in that area today?
It doesn't appear to be, and I should say, anybody's interested in Bigfoot, you got to make the pilgrimage to Bluff Creek. It really is a magical place, and I'm a little scared to see how much damage was done from the fire. So I guess I'll
Mm.
see when I go out there in the summer. But it's such an amazing place, and like I said, all the historic spots are just right next to each other. I remember the first time I went up there, I went across the Notice Creek Bridge, which is right past Louse Camp, and I write about that, and there's actually inscribed in the concrete, this is 1958. I remember just getting a chill, and chill ran down
Wow.
my spine when I read that. So yeah, Bluff Creek is a really magical place, and back in the 1950s, it really was the final frontier in America. Of course, this is before Alaska was admitted, statehood. So as I write in the book, the 50s was the right time, and Bluff Creek was absolutely the right place for Bigfoot. If Bigfoot was going to exist anywhere in the lower 48 in the 1950s, that would be the spot.
It is a magical place from what I've heard, what I've
Hmm.
seen. Hopefully someday I will be able to check it out. But Dustin, man, this has been
Yeah.
such a fun chat
Yeah.
about your book, The Abominable Snowman of California. I highly recommend everyone pick up a copy of this. Is best place to get it on Amazon still?
That's the only places
Only
that
place.
is
All right.
being sold. Yeah, I always say I try to go with the traditional publisher, irreconcilable creative differences. So I ended
Yep.
up self-publishing. I always say I went with the director's cut. I was ready to edit a lot of the book, but I knew if it was pitched to a general audience and went through a traditional publisher, I would have to really shrink it down. But
Mm.
when I knew I was going the self-publishing route, I was like, the hell with it. I'm just going to leave it all in there and just have one big book. Since it would probably
I'm
be a
glad you did.
niche book for Bigfooters. Yeah, yeah.
Oh man. If this is the first time that you've heard about it, those that are listening, you need to pick it up if you're into Bigfoot history, if you're a nerd for Bigfoot, or if you just like a good read. It is a fascinating read, easy to read, but also tons of details. Is something for everyone in this book. But Dustin, thank you so much for coming on. Is there a way that people can keep up to date with what you're doing and all that?
I don't think so. Like I said, I anticipate around this time next year having that second book ready to go. So I'm sure I'm trying to promote it earlier next time. So I'm sure around the summertime you'll be hearing about the second book. I don't even have a title for it yet. But yeah, it just basically picks up where the last one left off. And as everybody knows, the Patterson film is the most interesting thing about the Bigfoot history. So yeah.
That's gonna be wild, dude. I'm looking forward to it. But thank you so much for coming on,
Yeah, thanks,
Dustin.
Jeremiah. Appreciate it. This is fun.